Welcome to BIB Today, the daily business podcast from the newsroom of business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. The provincial election campaign is roughly at its halfway mark, and a new poll from Researchco indicates the incumbent NDP government has a strong lead still. Much has yet to happen. A debate this Tuesday, for instance, but much will need to happen to jar John Horgan's party from the lead. Our columnist and public opinion researcher, Mario Canseco, the president of Researchco, is a regular guest with us here in the podcast. And today he brings some new findings. Hi, Mario.
Hi, Kirk. Great to be here.
Let's look right away at, I know we're not supposed to really examine horse race stuff terribly much, but let's look at the horse race here and what it looks like at this juncture.
Well, I think the main issue here is there was no big bounce for the BC Liberals after some of the announcements that they made. They're down 1 point from when we had them at the start of the campaign. The NDP has gained 4 points. So now it's essentially a 12-point lead for the NDP in the horse race. The BC Conservatives are not running candidates in many places, and that manifested itself with a new drop for this party. And the BC Greens are fairly steady, but not at the level that they had in the last election. So the story of the horse race right now is people who voted for the Greens in 2017 are going to the NDP more so than the BC Liberals, particularly if there's no candidate in the riding that is running for the Green Party. But also a little bit of difficulty from the Liberals in establishing that emotional connection with voters. You know, there's been a lot of policy talk, discussions about public safety, taxation, but there's no emotion behind it that is making people to really give the BC Liberals a second look.
And has there emerged any kind of ballot box issue, Mario?
Well, this is one of the trickiest campaigns that I've been involved in as far as where the people are going. 3.5 years ago, it was mostly related to housing, economy and jobs back in 2013 more than anything. What we have now is a mixture that really depends a lot on the area where you live and the age that you have. If you're young, if you're urban, you're more likely to be worried about housing, homelessness, poverty. If you're middle-aged, you're thinking about economy and jobs. If you're over 55, you're looking at healthcare. COVID-19 as an issue has dropped. I think what we see here from the electorate is that they know we're in this for the long haul, and they seem to be satisfied with the way in which the NDP government has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's not something that is going to move votes necessarily. People want to hear about policy options because this is not a government that's elected only to look at COVID-19. It's elected to look at everything for the next 4 years.
And yet a big tax break like the one the Liberals are proposing in terms of a moratorium on the PST for a year, or the expenditure by the Horgan government of the $1,000 to the households of $125,000 or less in income would be defining characteristics of the campaign. And yet your results are indicating hasn't really moved the needle for either side.
No, it's not really working as far as, essentially facilitating the NDP to be, 25 points ahead, which is something that we've seen in other jurisdictions. It's not working in that fashion. And I think we see the same problem with the PST rebate. There's a situation here where the lack of an emotional connection that leads to Andrew Wilkinson being more likable and John Horgan not being more likable is making this unworkable for the Liberals. I think we can all go back to the Paul Martin campaign versus Stephen Harper, 2005, 2006. The idea of a GST reduction is very popular because at the time there was a lot of misgivings about Paul Martin's government because of the sponsorship scandal. So when people are already wary about the federal government, it's easy to say, hey, we will do it differently and we'll give you some money back. They haven't done this. I think they tried in the first couple of weeks. We shouldn't be having this election. Why have an election during this pandemic? Did it move the needle? No. And if you haven't moved the needle emotionally, you can't connect policy-wise.
Right, because again, like a lot of these elections that appear to be ill-timed or opportunistically timed, there is an initial rush of emotion that exists in any campaign. Why in this case, Mario, don't you think that stuck to John Horgan?
I think there's two issues at play. One of them is the fact that there's a high level of confidence in the way the BC government has handled COVID-19. That is definitely part of the equation here. You might be upset that you're being asked to vote, but you're not voting for a government that has been mishandled this. Part of the situation that we see in the United States in some of the polling that we've conducted is that there's no idea that the election was going to be happening in the middle of this pandemic, but it is, because it's a set date. And people are wondering, well, would we be better off with somebody else handling COVID-19 instead of Donald Trump? And the answer clearly is Joe Biden. When we ask British Columbians who is better to handle COVID-19, more than half of them say that it's John Horgan. So even people who aren't planning on voting for the NDP believe that he's a far superior person to handle COVID than Andrew Wilkinson.
Well, and even in your findings, the handling of the economy even comes up. And this, if someone had told me at any point that the New Democrats would be considered to be better economic stewards in the British Columbian populace than, say, the BC Liberals, I would have been astonished.
Well, they were astonishing numbers. One of the problems that we see here is in elections that are close, like the one we had in 2017, you still see the BC Liberals higher than the NDP when it comes to leadership on issues such as economy and jobs, to a lesser extent public safety, energy, and we don't see that. We don't see Andrew Wilkinson connecting at the same level. The Sonia Furstenau does very well as the environment, and that is something that is expected, and it's happened to everybody before. It happened to Jane Sterk, it happened to Andrew Weaver. But when it comes to the issues that the two major parties can handle, you're used to seeing the BC Liberals doing better on financial stuff, and it's just not manifesting itself right now. And we're running out of time in a way. People are already voting, and it's complicated for them to try to establish that connection policy-wise. I think it's more of a favorability issue, which seems to be on the side of Horgan because of the pandemic, and not on the side of Wilkinson.
You've been doing a lot of research in this campaign, including quite a bit of research on the mail-in ballots. The mail-in ballots this time stand to be the difference makers, don't they? Because we're now at over 600,000 that are out there. Potentially all of those will be mailed in, although I imagine quite a few of them won't. The people will still show up in person. But when I looked at the 17 results, there were very few landslide victories. And I wonder whether this is going to be one of the most confusing election nights we have, where you won't be able to really declare many winners.
Well, it is definitely going to be confusing because we're looking into a number of votes cast by mail that is higher than ever. But last time around, we had around 6,000 votes that were cast by mail. And it was essentially an issue in the Courtney Comots riding because you had a very close race and you still had to count some of those mail-in ballots. Now we have 100 times as many ballots that are going to be counted by mail. And that process begins after election night. Yeah. So we might have a situation on election night.
In fact, it's 13 days later that it starts, right?
Because 13 days later.
You have to get the ballots back to the returning offices to make sure they go to the right place, and then to ensure that, you and I aren't out there voting multiple times, right?
Well, and this is one of the reasons for the election to be so compelling. This is supposed to be a recourse. Okay, if I'm moving away, if I'm going to be traveling, I'll vote by mail. It's not supposed to be the system. And right now it is the system. You have so many people voting by mail, and there weren't any discussions about whether some of these votes should be counted before. How do you tackle the issue of making sure that somebody doesn't vote twice? That has to happen, according to legislation, 13 days after the election. So if you have a place where everybody feels safe and votes, and let's say for the sake of argument, 60% of the vote is in on that night, and 70% of the vote goes for a candidate, that would be a simple one to call. But it's not something that we faced before. And this is ultimately one of the problems. We're not going to have, as the Americans like to say right now, that peaceful transfer or peaceful, everybody stays where they are, because we won't be having election night speeches, because nobody's going to want to concede when more than half of the vote is yet to be counted.
Yeah. The one thing, though, again, back to your research, where people are not necessarily holding John Horgan accountable for calling an election at this point. They also don't appear to be holding him accountable for what might be a very confusing, vague election night.
No, and I think that's also part of the situation that we face here. I think there was an opportunity, if you kind of knew that an election was coming, there was an opportunity to try to think about ways in which to make this safer. And there was probably a lot of discussion related to how we can vote safely, how are we supposed to make this work on account of specific polling stations, for instance, but I don't think they anticipated the amount of ballots that are going to be mailed. And this ultimately has a lot to do with the confidence that you have in a specific government. Now, that being said, 90% of BC residents and likely voters feel that Elections BC is perfectly up to this job. You know, we're not going to be having a situation where people are afraid of mail-in fraud. And
Right.
that is definitely a different situation than what we see in the United States, where some states always vote by mail.
Mm.
Others are doing it more so this time around. And the contending parties are already complaining about what the other will do.
Yeah, we don't really know where the mail-in ballots are going to come in from. I mean, I think you can take a look at it now, and there's on average about 7,000 of these in each riding. There's bound to be more in the bigger ridings and fewer in the smaller ridings and all of that. But in the end, do we have to necessarily think that the people who are using these mail-in ballots are the really dedicated voters? And so as a result, could we even see that these mail-in ballots form an even larger proportion than the raw numbers might suggest today, where 40% of the ballots? Might that even be higher, because these are the people that actually want to vote and they're prepared to go through the process of mailing a ballot in?
That's definitely true. I think there's an opportunity to look into the behavior of the mail-in voter, because we have a sample size that is quite considerable.
Yeah.
Is this something that is happening because you are highly partisan, you like the person you have in charge of your district, and you want to vote for them immediately, and you know how to spell the name, and you're going to write it correctly and send it back? Is this the kind of voter, or is it the kind of voter that is sort of confused and doesn't want to do anything because they don't want to get exposed to COVID-19? It's really tough to tell at this stage. But ultimately, I think it's really about figuring out what to do in the future. I mean, we're all hoping for the end of the pandemic and the opportunity to go back to the polling station and get that really nice sticker that they give you at the end. But is it time to do something different? Is it time to think about online voting now that everybody's doing online banking?
Yeah, exactly. Last area, and let's take a look at the debate that's coming on Tuesday. Once again, trailing in the polls, Andrew Wilkinson likely has to have some kind of a strategy, a debate night strategy. What do you think for him offers any opportunity, and what might work?
Well, I think looking into some of the economic management issues might work well. I think he will definitely try to talk about the $1,000 rebate. He'll talk about specific promises that the NDP has made. Touching ICBC is probably not the right course of action.
No.
Discussing the fact that the election is happening during this pandemic didn't really work for them before. And ultimately, I think it's really about establishing that emotional connection. Christy Clark was able to establish that connection, look into the camera, try to figure things out. I think it worked well for her a couple of times. And in the last election, it essentially led the governing party to a tie in voting intention. So, I mean, it's an issue more about connecting with the voters. And, the one of the key aspects here, both for Andrew Wilkinson and for Sonia Furstenau, is okay. So this seems to be a foregone conclusion. People are very happy with the way COVID-19 has been handled. But are we really going into this debate trying to save as many seats as we can? And ultimately, I think that's also part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, how do the Liberals, in particular, put the focus on the next 4 years instead of the last 4 months?
Well, I think it's ultimately connecting on issues that the voters who usually are supportive of the Liberals care about. And, we haven't seen a lot of that, particularly because COVID-19 seems to be taking over everything. We are happy with the handling of this pandemic, and you don't want to let somebody else handle it for you, even somebody who is actually a medical doctor. They haven't had an opportunity to establish that emotional connection. And I think it's really more about the fact, and this is something that has been discussed by the Greens at length, things were working fine. We had a pandemic in the middle of a minority government and we all behaved well. Nobody tried to topple anybody. Send more Green people if you want to keep the government accountable, even if we're not part of some sort of coalition deal. And the same situation for the Liberals. This is not a campaign that started with an emotional advantage for the Liberals. You can't connect as an opposition party when people don't know where your leader stands, and you can't challenge an incumbent leader who's at 60 something when it comes to his own rating. It's too complicated. You need to plant the seed of doubt, and they had 2 weeks to do so, and they failed.
Yeah. Mario, it's always good talking to you. We're going to check in, of course, before the vote comes, or what I would call like the second last result in this election campaign before the 24th. But always good talking to you. Thanks for your help today.
My pleasure, Kirk. Anytime.
Mario Canseco is the president of Researchco, a public research firm here and based in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief of Business in Vancouver. Thanks a lot for watching BIV Daily.